Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. We are just quickly letting everyone into the room, and we'll just give it a minute or so just for everyone to join us. This is the fourth in our series of foundation level webinars looking at climate-related financial disclosure in South Africa. Yeah, so I'm just giving it a minute, but it does look like everyone has joined us, so we will kick off. So yeah, thank you very much for joining us. Start off with just a quick bit of admin as we start. If you could please all keep your microphones off and your videos off if you're not speaking, that'd be great. We're hoping to keep the session quite interactive. So please feel free to post questions in the chat as the people are presenting. Also, please feel free to respond to questions in the chat. If you want to, if you like to. What we are going to be doing is there will be a formal Q&A at the end of the session, but also we'll also stop after each of the speakers for a quick Q&A session, just to kind of deal with the burning issues, and then any overflow questions we'll deal with at the end of the session. So this webinar will be recorded and will be shared with all participants. It will also be available on the project website, which is the address you can see on the screen at the moment. If you have any problems with Zoom, if there are any technical difficulties, if you could please email Safaku at Six Capitals, he'll be able to assist you with that. And then, yeah, thank you very much for joining us, and we're looking forward to a very interesting and interactive session. Just a quick overview of how we'll be running the session. I'll do a quick introduction. I'll tell you who I am and who all the speakers are. Then we'll do a quick overview of the project, that we're representing here today. And then we'll get into the interesting stuff. Then we'll start the presentation first looking at the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. What is it and where it came from? And then we'll look a bit more at what is the state of global and local disclosure. And as I said, after that, we'll have a quick Q&A session for any of the questions that we haven't been discussed, and then we'll close off. If I could also please ask you, if you do have the opportunity to stay till the end, that'll be much appreciated. We will be loading a survey at the end of the of the webinar, which is just to give us an idea of how we can make these sessions better, and also to make sure which issues are interesting to you, and what we can address going forward in future sessions. And then we'll try and close promptly at 1 o'clock. All right, so that's 2 o'clock South African time. Okay, so welcome. Welcome, everyone. We're very glad you could join us. My name is Brent Kluter. I'm from DNA Economics. We're one of the partners implementing the project that we were discussing with you today, and we'll be introducing in a bit. This project is very fortunately being funded by UK PACT, which is the UK Partnership for Accelerated Climate Transitions. We'll have a quick introduction to UK PACT from our esteemed colleague, Tapelo Tladi. Tapelo is a geoscientist and energy and sustainability professional. His interests and professional experience include climate change mitigation policy and economics, renewable energy development, and sustainable natural resource management. He has experience in these areas across the mining industry, management consulting, and international development. And in his current role, he works for the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office at the British High Commission in Pretoria, where he is the head of UK PACT and international climate finance programs in the climate change and energy team. So we're very fortunate to have Tapelo joining us today, and then he'll give you a quick introduction to the project. So to UK PACT. After that, I'll provide you with a slightly more detailed introduction to the actual project, that as part of which this training is being provided. And then the first session looking at TCFD, our colleague from WWF, Seren Mutre, will be presenting that. He's an investment analyst within the sustainable finance team and the business development unit. Previously, Seren has worked for leading insurance and asset management companies in various roles, focusing on research, strategy, sustainability, and responsible investment. Since joining the WWF South Africa in 2016, Seren has been working at integrating environmental risk management principles into investment management, also promoting sustainable finance and developing green financial solutions. Seren currently sits on investment committees for the Green Outcomes Fund and the Sanlam Living Planet Fund, and is part of the WWF team working on the Sustainable Landscape for the Sustainable Landscape Finance Coalition. So we're very fortunate to have Seren and all his experience to introduce the TCFD to us. And then the next session on the state of global and current disclosure will be led by Melanie Smith. She's the practice head for research and reporting at Six Capital Advisory. In this role, Melanie heads up the ESG research and reporting capability in supporting Six Capital's clients, such as the South Africa-UK PACT fund project we're currently talking about. Melanie also led the Six Capital's research process together with WWF and Sanlam, looking at the state of Tcfd reporting in South Africa, which is a great publication, which you'll be well worth looking out for. Melanie has also recently completed a master's in sustainability at the Sustainability Institute at the University of Stellenbosch. So we're very fortunate to have some really interesting and some really fortunate, really exciting speakers. I will now hand you over to our esteemed colleague Tapelo Claudi to give us a quick introduction to UK PACT. Tapelo, over to you.
Thanks very much, Brent, for that introduction and that welcome. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this webinar. Thank you to all the project partners, DNA Economics and the wider consortium team delivering this project, for organizing these sessions. And thank you once again to everyone joining for just availing yourself on this Friday afternoon. I just thought I should give you some information and just some background to what the PACT program is about, as well as the UK government department funding it. So as Brent said in his opening address, UK PACT stands for Partnering for Accelerated Climate Transitions. It's a technical assistance and capacity building program that is being funded by the UK's Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. It's a program that forms that is part of a portfolio of programs actually being funded by BEIS in what is called the UK's International Climate Finance. And essentially the purpose of UK PACT, or what the program actually seeks to do, is to support developing countries, mainly emerging economies, to achieve their NDC commitments. The program is demand-driven, so meaning that all the interventions that we provide and that we work on in the program are based on demand from these countries and partner governments. So essentially assistance that they come to us with and say that they need help with. We do not prescribe any form of assistance, but ours is just to make sure that the assistance we do provide is in line with the partner countries achieving their NDC commitments. It's globally, the program operates in a number of countries, including South Africa. So PACT is present in Colombia, in China, in Malaysia, in Mexico. And there we run what we call country programs. And these are basically facilities, so project-based technical assistance facilities where we provide grant funding for TA projects such as this one, that work in these countries with governments, support governments in these countries on specific agendas. So in South Africa, we work on a number of different issues, which I'll touch upon in the next slide. But in terms of the other components of PACT, aside from the country programs, we also have what is known as a Green Recovery Challenge Fund. And this is also project-based technical assistance support that actually touches on not just green recovery issues that obviously many countries around the world are grappling with at the moment, but climate change mitigation issues that are common to a number of different countries. So the sort of projects we support there are more regional in nature and basically cover a multitude of countries that across a theme that is common to all of them. The last sort of component of the program that we also work in is called skill shares and secondments. And this is where we actually embed expertise in country, either through combining local stakeholders with UK experts across a particular theme for them to exchange knowledge, to exchange insights. Themes may include green finance, it could be knowledge relating to the just energy transition, whatever the case is. We would facilitate them coming together and exchanging knowledge across these themes for anything ranging from 2 weeks to 6 months. or we can also support secondments into partner government institutions where we embed an expert into that institution for a certain amount of time. So essentially, UK PACT is structured along these three components, and we operate across all three here in South Africa. Next slide, please, Brent. So in terms of South Africa's UK PACT program and essentially how it's structured, the sort of support we provide and the areas we cover, it's mainly structured across three themes. So we look at providing technical assistance and capacity building in sustainable finance or related to sustainable finance and green finance, sustainable transport, and energy. And within energy, we really focus on three themes. So energy efficiency and demand side management, renewable energy and alternative fuel sources development, as well as the just energy transition, which is arguably the most salient challenge confronting our energy system today. Collectively, we have about 10 projects that we are currently supporting across these three themes, and our portfolio in this regard is worth over £3 million. All the projects that we are supporting are really aimed but we also see it as one that seeks to enable poverty alleviation in our country, and also just broader socioeconomic development in South Africa. So in terms of where you can find out more information about the PACT program, you can visit our website there. There's some, it's on the screen right now. And there are some resources there that will tell you more about the South Africa-UK PACT program. And then in terms of this specific project that we're supporting related to climate-related financial disclosure, you can visit the DNA Economics website where you can get more information about this project. In terms of our support for this project, it really emanates from the fact that climate-related financial disclosure.
Tapelo, I think you've just broken. I think we've just lost Tapelo there for a second. Let's just see if he reconnects. Well, these are the times we live in. So Tapelo, thank you very much for I think that's actually quite a fortuitous moment to lose you, as you were just starting to tell us about the. You were just tell us about the project, which is the next part of our presentation anyway. So I will quickly give you a overview of this project and exactly what we're doing. So the project is called Aligning South Africa's Climate-Related Financial Disclosure with International Best Practice. The purpose of it really is to try and understand what is international best practice in terms of understanding climate-related risks and opportunities. This, of course, has been moved forward immensely by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which our colleague Sarah will tell you all about in a couple of minutes. So the objective of this project really is, even though we're focusing on the TCFD, and what we're trying to do is much more basic, which we're really trying to get the use of detailed, useful and timely climate-related disclosures into the market so that this information can be used in investment decision making in South Africa. So we want to be sure that all the capital we're deploying in South Africa, is consistent with with a transition to a low carbon economy, in order to ensure that we don't end up with sunk assets or stranded assets or sunk cost or anything like that. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to enhance the impact of existing initiatives. Looking at TCFD, there's a number of initiatives driven by the National Treasury, for example. There's also some great work being done by the National Business Institute and others looking at this area. So our explicit focus is to work with these initiatives in order to magnify the impact. Now, our initial focus is going to be looking at transition risk. You'll understand these terms a bit better, later on, or if you work through some of the earlier sessions. And we'll be looking at how that affects listed equities, particularly in the asset management and pension fund industries. We're hoping to, in future, also look at at physical risk and in other types of financial institutions, other types of asset classes, and so forth. But we will also, as part of this project, be looking at the data sources available for considering physical risk, and what barriers still remain to be overcome in order to do the same level of analysis on physical risk as we'll be doing on transition risk in this project. It is a demand-led process, so we are working quite closely with with our partners and also our beneficiaries, and I'll tell you a bit more about that on the next slide. So it's currently, yeah, I mean, we've brought together a number of institutions to help us implement this project, and we try to really get a combination of international best practice, which is where we've got our colleagues from Vivid Economics, who's really at the forefront of TCFD disclosure and climate-related risk and opportunity analysis internationally. We combined that with a deep understanding of the South African kind of mitigation and climate change area. This is where our own company, DNA Economics, and then also our colleagues, the Greenhouse, based in Cape Town. We have a long history in working in climate change policy making in South Africa. And for well over a decade, and we wanted to use these insights and this knowledge, to try and support the TCFD scheme moving forward, or TCFD initiative moving forward. And then we also brought together, some really cutting edge insights into ESG, South African low carbon investment and South African sustainability, through our colleagues from WWF South Africa and at Six Capitals. And we think that this mix of companies means that we've got the skills to really provide some useful support to the market on climate-related financial risks and opportunities. Now, our project is structured around, we have a steering committee, which is Batseta and ASISA, the asset manager and pension fund associations, and also the JSE. They are our direct steering committee. But then we also have a broad advisory group, as you can see on the right there, to also make sure that the project is applicable more broadly to the South African market. And then we have a number of different levels of engagement on the project. Really at the highest level, there's a number of literature and communication pieces we're putting out on the project website, where everyone is free to engage in. And then we also have these training webinars, where this is foundation level training. There'll also be more sophisticated training during the second half of or the second half of this project. Will be during the third and fourth quarters of this year. And in the training, there's a number of interactive sessions and workshops going forward. Information on all of these will be on our project website, and you're also more than welcome to join in on any of these sessions. Now, the project broadly really has three main work streams. The first is capacity building and awareness raising, which is part of what you are here today. We want to create a basic understanding of climate-related financial impacts, and also why it's important, what's happening internationally, and so on. We're doing this largely through webinars, workshops, and other slightly longer sessions. Then what we're also going to be doing is engaging, with asset managers and pension funds over the course of this process, to understand exactly what their needs are. And then we're trying to develop a toolkit that can support the analysis of climate-related financial risks and opportunities in South Africa. So this toolkit, is both a source of data and information, and also some guidance on how one would actually go about doing a number of this analysis. But then a very exciting third stream of our project is, in partnering with our colleagues at Vivid Economics and their sister company Planitrix, we are doing a full transition risk analysis of a portfolio of 50 highly invested JSE listed companies. So we're using their best practice international models, which we've tweaked with sort of local insights about the carbon price pathways and things like that, to do a full analysis, which we will then use to develop an example best practice disclosure, which we will be releasing towards the third or fourth quarter of this year. So yeah, this will all be available on our website. As I mentioned, all the publications will be freely available, open source download, and also all the tools developed will also be able to be downloaded from our website. Yep, as I mentioned, we've already there's already a number of publications on the website. There was one looking at climate-related financial disclosure for financial institutions, written by our colleagues at Vivid, and providing detailed guidance as to how to start the disclosure journey for financial institutions. Then, we also did some research looking at the kind of disclosure landscape in South Africa at the moment, which some of those insights will be shared with you today. And then our colleagues at WWF and Six Capitals did a very extensive exercise looking at at more than 50 of the largest companies on the JSE, and they developed detailed fact sheets that that provide an overview of exactly the level of climate-related financial disclosure provided by these companies. And then also our colleagues at WWF and Six Capitals brought all of this together in a very nicely packaged publication, that's available on the LabHub Edu platform. It's really a very nice, accessible resource that is the whole purpose was to make this easier to engage with, and all the kind of dense research put it in in more lay terms and easier to engage with. So yeah, if you could please, if you go and have a look at the website on the screen currently, you'll find links to all of these resources. You'll also find links to to future training and all the future outputs and activities that we'll be undertaking as part of this project. And as I mentioned, so we'll be developing the a kind of toolkit, which will form the basis for the future training. We're currently in the process, of engaging with with stakeholders to understand what should go into this toolkit. But really, it will be a combination of data sources, guidance and checklists, and then also potentially some modules that some spreadsheets and that can be used to perform some basic calculations that will feed into the climate-related financial risk and opportunity analysis process, and then hopefully that information can then be used to disclose that disclose that more broadly. Okay, so that was the project in a nutshell. You'll find all our contact details on the on the project website. So if you want to engage with us further going forward, we're very open to that. So also just mention that these webinars they are being recorded, and one session from each of the themes will be uploaded to the website. So we're hoping to have those up either today or early next week. So please, if there's anything you'd like to refer back to, it is publicly available on the website. Okay, well, that brings us to the end. Of going through all the the kind of background information. It's our time to get into the more interesting stuff. So I will now hand over to my colleague Sarah Mudre to start us off on the real meat of the project.
Thanks, Brent. Good day, everyone. Let me just share my screen for a moment. Hopefully, you all can see that and hear me clearly.
Yep, can see you and hear you clearly. Thanks, Sarah.
Fantastic. So good day all, and thank you for attending today's session on climate risk reporting frameworks and trends in climate-related disclosures. So I'll be taking you through the next part of today's session, which is Introduction to the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures and their recommendations. And my session today will start with a quick view on existing climate reporting frameworks. And then we'll move into the introduction of the TCFD, starting with a brief background on the task force, followed by a deeper look at the recommendations and thematic areas, and then getting into the guidance on what to disclose within those thematic and core areas. But before we dive into the content, I'd like to start with the poll. So Sfako, if you could please load the first poll for today onto the screen. This poll is about checking which climate-related disclosure framework are you most familiar with. So is it CDP, TCFD, the GRI, or the Science-Based Targets Initiative? See some votes coming in through. TCFD seems to be leading the way, followed by GRI and then CDP. So it's good to see that a lot of people are familiar with TCFD. So hopefully this session today can be a bit more informative for you guys and take you closer to the heart of the guidance of the recommendations. And many are familiar with the Global Reporting Initiative, followed by CDP. That's interesting. In our previous webinar that we held, that was a repeat of today's, CDP was actually ahead of the GRI. So today, we see that's switched around. So I see the poll numbers starting to increase. So thanks to everyone for participating. That was great. It's good to have you engaging with us. And just as a further reminder, please do pop any questions you have into the chat, and my colleagues or myself will do our best to get to it, or other participants on today's webinar might be able to assist with any questions you have as well. Getting into the first part of my talk today was on climate reporting frameworks. So there are a number of climate reporting frameworks, and these are shown on screen. And the ones shown on screen are the most popular and probably widely used. TCFD recommendations, of course, is gaining popularity, and we'll get to that in a bit. But CDP has been around for a number of years and is also very popular amongst companies and investors. The Global Reporting Initiative, Sustainability Accounting Standards Boards, International Integrated Reporting Council are further examples of organizations who have put together frameworks to help companies disclose information on climate change and help investors access that information. So these bodies have been very influential in getting disclosures to the level that they are today and working at aligning their frameworks to help consolidate and standardize the way in which climate information is disclosed. So while they might have started as independent frameworks, they are now coming together to help consolidate these. And TCFD is a great example of kind of how all these frameworks are aligning, but I'll get to that in a moment. I also wanted to allude to Science-Based Targets Initiative, which we will go further into detail in a future webinar as part of the series. But this initiative has been guiding companies in thinking about how to set targets and monitor their climate action progress against those targets. As you will see later, this could be useful for the fourth theme of the Tcfd recommendations, which is around metrics and targets. I would like to take a moment to highlight the CDP. As mentioned, this is one of the most popular disclosure platforms and frameworks. Over 9,600 companies report through CDP, and many South African companies do so as well. The CDP framework covers a number of important areas, as shown on the screen, which is from governance to strategy to verification to energy, etc. The CDP's achievements represents milestones in climate-related risk disclosure. It is widely used by companies and investors, and although we don't have time to go through all of these, luckily there is significant overlap between the CDP framework and the Tcfd recommendations. And this is something that CDP themselves recognize, that there is a strong link between the two. So companies which disclose through CDP are doing so broadly in line with the Tcfd recommendations. So both CDP and Tcfd will help investors and companies make climate smart investment decisions. CDP and Tcfd are both meant to be more than reporting frameworks or guides for disclosure. They are meant to be used as tools for companies and management to guide them in thinking about how to manage and integrate climate risk into their business. CDP is still appealing, and we had some comments on this in our last webinar about people transferring from CDP to Tcfd and choosing one or the other. But CDP is still appealing, and the scoring capability of and historical data sets are big advantages. However, CDP disclosures can become a bit too comprehensive or repetitive or overwhelming for investors to digest and for companies to report on. So with that, I'd like to go into the introduction to the Tcfd. And to start that, I'd like to start with a bit of background. So the Global Financial Stability Board established a task force to develop recommendations for more effective climate-related disclosures that can support services like investment, credit, and underwriting to better ensure that climate risk is being considered and integrated within operations. The FSB, and therefore the Tcfd, is committed to market transparency as it makes markets more efficient and stable. But the recommendations are more than disclosures and more than market transparency. It's also meant to help companies in understanding their climate-related risks and provide guidance on how to manage those risks. In our first session as part of the series, we highlighted why climate risk is important. The FSB also recognized this risks and set up a task force to develop a set of recommendations. In developing the recommendations, the task force engaged with multiple stakeholders across different groups, across their broad member and network base. One of the reasons why Tcfd has become so popular and why it's so widely adopted is because of the people involved, like Markani and Michael Bloomberg, but also because it was developed with a great mix and good inputs from multiple stakeholders. There has been significant momentum in uptake of Tcfd. It's been quite remarkable. And my colleagues later on in this session will touch more on the trends, but an introduction and background in Tcfd couldn't be done without talking about the momentum that we've seen TCFD grow. Over 1,500 organizations have adopted in a short space of time, and this is quite impressive considering they only released their recommendations at the end of 2017. So I'd like to stop here before jumping to the next section to take a poll. So Sofako, if you could load the next poll onto the screen, please. Has your organization become a formal TCFD supporter, or are you actively considering taking up the recommendations? So it's quite close on this poll. We see that quite a few people are saying not yet. They haven't become a formal supporter. Some people are not sure. Some are, yes, they're actively considering taking up the recommendations. And there's a couple in the room today who are already formal supporters. So an interesting mix of people here. We've got people at kind of all ends of the spectrum. So thanks all for those who participated in the poll. It's great to see the results come through, and that will help us, guide us through the next part of the sessions as well. So now we start to jump into the recommendations. And the recommendations of the task force are structured around 4 thematic areas. So the 4 core areas of TCFD are governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. The recommendations and guidance are also split into guidance for all sectors and then supplemental guidance for certain sectors. So therefore, the TCFD recommendations has broader appeal than that of just the financial sector. The 4 thematic areas are common touch points for any business in any sector and is therefore relevant well beyond the financial sector. This slide shows an overview of the 4 pillars of TCFD and the recommended disclosures within each pillar. In the next part of the session, I'll dive deeper into these recommended disclosures. So looking at the recommended disclosures and the disclosure guidance for each recommendation. Just as a reminder for those who are struggling to read this slide, and that these slides will be sent to you after the webinar or available after the webinar, but I will be going through each of these points in the next section to elaborate on all these points. But before we jump into the meat of this section, I'd like to run one more poll. Farko, if you could load the poll, please. This is about asking which of the 4 pillars of the Tcfd framework are you or your organization least comfortable with. Some results coming through, see that metrics and targets seem to be leading the way, followed by strategy and then risk management, with no responses for governance. A few more responses coming in. Yeah, metrics and targets seem to be the theme that most people are struggling with or least comfortable with. So that's good to know. So we'll be getting into the guidance on all of these themes in a bit, but it's good to see where everyone is kind of landing up. So thanks all to those who participated. Great to have you engaging with us. Please remember to pop any questions in the chat. So now jumping into the 4 themes. The first theme is about governance, which is asking organizations to disclose governance around climate-related risks and opportunities. And the second is around strategy, where the TCFD recommends organizations to disclose the actual and potential impacts of climate-related risks and opportunities on business strategy and financial planning. The third theme is around risk management, where companies should disclose how the organization identifies, assesses, manages climate-related risks and opportunities. And the 4th theme is around metrics and targets. So companies should disclose the metrics and targets they use to assess climate-related risks and manage climate-related risk and opportunities where material. So now we'll get into the first theme and the first recommended disclosure under the first theme. So the first pillar of TCFD is governance. And the recommendation is to disclose organizations' governance around climate-related risks. As guidance, the TCFD recommends that companies describe the board's oversight of climate-related risks And some of the things that organizations should highlight is the management processes for managing climate-related risks, how the board reviews climate data, how the board sets performance objectives, and how the board monitors all of this. The second part of the guidance theme is around describing how management assesses and manages climate-related risks and opportunities. Specifically, this is about disclosing the management level looking at climate-related risks and any committees or internal teams or internal structures that are focused on climate-related risks and how these work. So luckily, everyone was quite familiar with governance. We didn't see any responses in the poll where that showed people were struggling with the governance theme, but there were a few today who identified strategy as a certain pillar that they're not quite comfortable with. So there are 3 levels of guidance on disclosing strategy-related, climate-related disclosures. Firstly, it's about describing the climate-related risks and opportunities over the short, medium, and long term. So describing what the organizations consider relevant risks and how these manifest, as well as the description around these risks as related to those time horizons. If possible, organizations should also provide a description of risks and opportunities by sectors or geographies, if appropriate, as sector-specific and geographic-specific data information can be material in understanding and managing climate-related risks. The second part of the strategy thematic area is about describing the impact of climate-related risks and opportunities on the organization's business strategy and financial planning. So how could climate change risk and opportunities, if materialized, have an impact on products and services, the supply chain, value chains, as well as potential impacts on costs like operating costs, potential impacts on revenues, potential impacts on capital expenditures. Climate scenarios is also something that is important in TCFD, and disclosure around how access to capital will change under different scenarios is also an important element to think about, because access to capital could be constrained under a particular scenario, affecting strategy and affecting investment and lending decisions. Scenario analysis is a very important risk management tool. The big advantage of scenarios are that they are forward-looking. As a risk management tool, scenario analysis is very popular among financial services companies. For example, around capital management, adequacy, solvency, stress testing. Really, scenario analysis is a critical component of financial risk management. So the TCFD recommends that companies look at the resilience of the organization's strategy, taking into considerations different climate-related scenarios, including a 2-degree or lower scenario. And at WWF, we would also encourage people to look at targeting a 1.5-degree scenario, working with a 1.5-degree scenario. But with the world is on track for what could be 3 to 4-degree scenarios. We will have future sessions and training sessions as part of this overall project hosted by Vivid Economics and the Greenhouse that will go more deeply into discussing how to use scenario analysis. But here, my main aim is to highlight that the TCFD is encouraging organizations to look where and how their strategies could be affected under different scenarios. Moving on to the next theme, which is risk management. The recommendation here is for companies to disclose how they identify, assess, and manage climate-related risks. The first part of risk management guidance is about describing how the organization decides on the significance of the chosen climate-related risks and, if possible, in relation to how other risks are identified. Also important is describing the definitions or terminologies used within their processes, and describing definitions and terminology is important kind of throughout disclosures. As TCFD has a big focus on transition risks, organizations should also describe any risks they see coming from regulatory or legislation changes that could impact their business. The second part of the risk management theme is also on processes. It's about identifying and assessing climate-related risks, but here it's important to focus on the decisions made to mitigate, transfer, accept, or control those risks that were identified. The last part of the risk management theme is about how organizations integrate the climate-related risk management process within the overall organizational risk management process. So big on for all reporting frameworks and guidance and thinking about climate risk management is about integrating into the overall organizational structures and processes. So on to the final theme, which is about metrics and targets. It is recommended that organizations should disclose the metrics and targets used to assess and manage relevant climate-related risks and opportunities. So what are the key metrics used by the organization, as well as the definitions and methodologies used to calculate those metrics? Are there other metrics used, like those around water, energy, land use, and waste management? How do the most material metrics impact on remuneration, if at all? And can historical data of metrics be disclosed to allow for trend analysis? The next part about the metrics theme refers to scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions. So organizations should disclose their scope 1, 2, and when appropriate, their scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, as well as any adopted efficiency ratios. Historical data for trend analysis should also be provided. And the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the GHG protocol, is widely recognized as a great methodology for measuring greenhouse gas emissions, and organizations are encouraged to use it. I would think that most people, actually having read quite a few corporate reports, integrated reports, think that most people do use the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and greenhouse gas reporting has been something that's been around in South Africa for a little while now. It's not really a new thing. What is a bit newer and becoming increasingly topical is the setting of targets. Organizations are encouraged to set targets and to describe these targets set, as well as disclose their performance against those targets. In describing targets, organizations should consider whether the targets are absolute or intensity-based. Example, are you disclosing your total amounts of greenhouse gas emissions for scope 1, scope 2 total, and those are kind of absolute in CO2 equivalent tons, or do you want to do intensity-based measures where you take your absolute emissions and you scale that by revenue to get a greenhouse gas emission tons per million rand in revenue, as an example. Also, to be important for disclosing targets and setting targets is the timeframes that you use and the base year for when you will measure yourself against. And key performance indicators used to assess progress against targets should also be included. Before we conclude, I'd just like to run one last poll. Sparko, if you could please load the last poll for this section. In your opinion, do you think climate-related financial disclosures in South Africa are at an adequate level? So straight away, we see quite a few no's coming through, seems to dominate the responses. Some people are not sure, but no one, just one person seems to say yes, but still needs more attention, but no one is really saying that they feel that the level we are at now is quite adequate. So very interesting response here. So a lot of people think that there's a lot more work to do. And that being said, TCFD is part of that progress where we start to bring together what's needed from a climate change and climate risk management perspective with what's required from the financial sector. So emerging of climate science and emerging of financial sector data. I'd like to conclude today just by recognizing that climate-related financial reporting is still evolving, as many of you have just indicated in the poll. The task force recommendations provide a foundation to improve investors' and others' ability to appropriately assess and price climate-related risk and opportunity. The task force recommendation aim to be ambitious, but also practical for near-term adoption. The task force also expects to advance the quality of mainstream financial disclosures related to the potential effects of climate change on organizations today and in the future, and to increase investor engagement with boards and senior management on climate-related risks. So that's my time for today. Thank you all for attending, and thank you all for this opportunity. I'll pause there, stop sharing my screen, and if there's any questions, please do let me know.
Hi, Søren. Thank you very much. That was a great session. I think I've already seen one question come in, but I think before, just to give people a chance to quickly add a couple more questions for you before you drop off. There's a couple of comments from my side, and I think that was a great summary of the TCFD. And I think one thing that people often forget about or don't quite understand about the TCFD is just how flexible it really is. I mean, it is a very non-descriptive standard. I mean, it obviously requires certain types of information, but it leaves a lot of flexibility in terms of how to disclose it, what standards to use, and so on. It's really more focused on generating useful and timeless information than it is about but setting very specific themes. And also, I mean, a key part of the TCFD is that it advocates for an iterative approach, as Søren said, so that there's no barriers to starting the process. In order to do it well, that does require a bit of effort, but most organizations, that is second, third, fourth, fifth iteration of reporting. There really are no barriers to getting started, and that's how it's how it is being encouraged. And also, I guess the other point I think that people also, someone mentioned in a presentation I was the other day, quite interesting point, where they said that what people keep forgetting is the TCFD really is more a business strategy framework than it is a reporting standard. It's really, the purpose of the TCFD is to get people to start thinking about climate risks and opportunities and how to respond to those. So really the thought process is a lot more important than actually the disclosure process. Having said that, I think we'll go through the questions one by one, Sarah, and then I'll come back to you. So the first question was from Reinhard Arp. His question was, can organizations use ISO standards methods for measuring and reporting greenhouse gas emissions, or only greenhouse gas protocol under TCFD? And then he had a follow-up question, do targets have to align with a minimum temperature target?
Thanks, Brent, and thanks, Reinhard, for the question. Good to hear from you, man. So I think the ISO definitions for and methodology for greenhouse gases is quite good. It's similar to GHG protocol. I see people using both. The TCFD recommends the GHG protocol, and it's really robust framework, the GHG protocol, but what's important is also aligning methodologies. So if you have a home market that's using, one methodology, it really makes comparing data across companies easier. So while I don't want to criticize the ISO methodology, I just think that the advantage of TCFD is it's pushing people towards standardization, and the GHG protocol could go a long way in supporting that. I also think ISO and GHG protocol are not too far apart. So if you're doing one, you could easily do the other. So that's the first part of the question. And do targets have to align with the minimum temperature target? Targets should ideally align with the temperature target. So you should be thinking about a 50% reduction by 2030 and a reduction to net zero by 2050. And these are kind of aligned with the 1.5 degree scenario. Brent might be able to add any onto this, but I would advise that people think of their, setting their targets in line with kind of where they are located, their operations are located, in line with what their regulatory frameworks are suggesting in terms of the geographic regions they are. So South Africa, where the target should be, and then also, how that filters up into countries' national determined contributions and fair shares. But ideally, one would want to set targets that are aligned with a temperature scenario that supports a more sustainable future. So we would push for temperatures scenarios that's aligned with 1.5 degree or lower to really reduce the impacts of climate change. So I would encourage companies to look at how they can set targets aligned with temperature scenarios. And I think when we, in a future session, when we touch a bit more science-based targets initiatives, that's going to come out a bit more in detail. Yeah, thanks very much. And then I saw there was a question on the relationship between TCFD and King 4. So I'm gonna pass that question on to Adrian and Melanie. Hopefully they I think they'll be better placed to kind of to touch on that. But yeah, I think that they'll be a better one to answer that question for you. All righty. I see like there's no more questions in the chat. So with that, thanks everyone. Thanks, Brent. And I'll hand over to the Six Capitals team for the next session.
Okay, thanks, Ren. There was just one question that we missed, and that's just a question about the slides. The slides will be made available. We'll be loading them on the project website, so that address you saw earlier. But you can also, yeah, you can also contact the Six Capitals teams for the slides, but they will be on the project website. So all the slides and the recordings of one session of each of these trainings will be on the website. Okay, so we're moving on to Melanie now to tell us about the current state of disclosure. Melanie is was having a little bit of internet problems earlier on, so we'll see how it goes. So Melanie, let's give it a go. But if you do start to struggle, we do have a very capable backup in Adrian. But let's hope it goes well.
Yes, yeah. Had a squirrel here in the background trying to connect, and I'm on my phone's mobile hotspot now, hoping that the connection holds. So please flag to me if the connection or my audio becomes very unstable. To spare a bit of bandwidth, I'm going to turn off my video feed for today's session. And then just the question around King 4 and TCFD. I think Adrian is probably our resident expert. I almost want to call him on that front. So I'll ask him to chip in there once we get to the Q&A session. But while on that,
Melanie, I think you're struggling a little bit to hear you.
The trends in terms of transport. So yeah, Tcfd Framework. I will points.
Melanie, I think we.
Okay, let me try and speak a bit close to top area.
Thank you.
So yeah, thanks, Siren, for that introduction on the Tcfd framework.
Yeah, Melanie,
can I suggest one change? Why don't you try and speak, Melanie, and either myself or Brent can share the slides. Alternatively, I'll present.
Yeah, it does seem that the consolidated South African telecommunications market is once again causing havoc in terms of IT infrastructure. Yeah, Adrian, I wonder if you shouldn't just kick us off, and then we'll see if Melanie comes back. We can always try and swap back.
Good afternoon, everybody. Apologies for the technical challenges, but it seems to be a regional problem in the Western Cape. With connectivity. I'm Adrian Bertrand. I work alongside Melanie. So I'll help with her kind of section of today's webinar, looking at some of the global and local TCFD and climate related financial disclosure findings that we've seen. if you don't mind, I'm going to be relying on some of Melani's notes. So I'm also going to not show my video during the presentation, but I will come back for questions, etc. So let's see how we go, and apologies for this change of plan. All right, so the Financial Stability Board, which issued the TCFD framework, is certainly very pleased with the uptake of the TCFD framework in terms of organizations applying the recommendations. Internationally, one now has more than 2,300 organizations which are supporting the TCFD recommendations. Of those 2,300 organizations, they are based in more than 88 countries around the world. And this slide shows the uptake of reporting against the TCFD recommendations from 2017. Sorry, this is in terms of domestic South African reporters, the image on the left-hand side of the screen. So in 2017, you would have seen just under 300 reporters using the TCFD framework. In 2020, last year, just under 750, and already in the first quarter of 2021, we are seeing an increased uptake in terms of those TCFD aligned reports that have already been published this year. So the expectation is that we will see even more TCFD aligned reports coming from reporting organizations in the country. And you'll see in all of these slides, which will be made available to everybody after the webinar, that we have included links to the various sources that have been referred to in terms of these slides. So the Financial Stability Board publishes an annual status report on the uptake of the TCFD framework globally. Their last report was published in September of last year. And so we're expecting the next report to be coming out publicly within the next month or so. And the Financial Stability Board provides a few key findings in the status report, which they produce. And some of the key findings are that around 60% of the world's 100 largest public companies are formal supporters of the TCFD framework. And since the issuance of the first status back in 2019, it's been an increase of over 85% from the initial reporting rounds. And so, of course, the Stability Board and the TCFD are quite pleased with these developments. In terms of companies that are leading, in terms of TCFD disclosures, it's understandably energy companies and materials companies that are those sectors and companies that have got higher environmental impacts. And of course, other sectors and other industries are following in terms of uptake. Where the status report has identified room for improvement. In terms of the fiscal year 2019 reporting, 40% of disclosures were from energy companies and 30% for materials and buildings companies. And it seems that there's definitely room for improvement in terms of companies reporting on the resilience of their climate strategy. So the annual review found that the percentage of companies disclosing the resilience of their strategies, taking into consideration different climate-related scenarios, was significantly lower than that of the other recommended disclosures per the TCFD framework. Also interesting is that the investor community, institutional investors such as retirement funds and asset managers, have started to report against the TCFD framework. This has been partially informed by the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, with their almost 4,000 signatories, which requires certain elements of TCFD reporting to be included in their annual reporting to the PRI. So whilst there has been progress on asset manager and retirement fund reporting, it's probably still not sufficient in terms of client and stakeholder requirements. And so that's certainly a work in progress for the financial sector to take on board TCFD reporting. Later on in this presentation, and certainly in the other webinars to come next week, we'll be looking at a few examples of South African financial sector entities that have already started publishing climate risk reports, which are extensively aligned to the TCFD recommendation. One of the other findings is that users of TCFD reporting find that the most useful element of the reporting, certainly as it comes to their decision making, is that of getting information from companies, from reporters about how they are addressing material climate-related issues relevant to their sector and geography, as well as their reporting on key metrics. And so it is important that we move from a more qualitative governance approach in our reporting on TCFD to more detail around metrics and also the different scenarios that are being considered. Moving on, in terms of climate related reporting trends and findings, as a kind of a key takeaway from this status report, we see that the disclosure of climate-related financial information has indeed increased since 2017, but more progress is still needed. On average, across the 11 recommended disclosures, there's been a 6 percentage point increase between 2017 and 2019, but there is still room for improvement in terms of how companies disclose on how climate will potentially impact on their business, their strategies, and financial planning. On average, disclosures that are TCFD aligned are made within organization sustainability reports. And it's 4 times more likely that when an organization wishes to report in a way that is aligned to the Tcfd framework, that they will do so in their sustainability reports as opposed to annual financial filings or annual reports. Also, interestingly, only 1 in 15 companies that were reviewed as part of this status report disclosed information on the resilience of their strategy in light of climate risk under the different climate-related scenarios. And so that's why this specific UK PACT funded project is also wanting to assist South African organizations, both reporters and investors, to better understand the various scenarios. Another finding was that larger companies were more likely to disclose information aligned to the TCFD recommendations, and on average 42% of companies with a market cap greater than $10 billion disclosed their information in alignment with the TCFD recommendations in 2019, whilst that 42% average is contrasted with a 15% average for companies with a market cap less than $3 billion. Lastly, energy companies and materials and buildings companies are currently leading when it comes to reporting in a TCFD aligned way. And this is expected to obviously change going forward as more and more sectors also start to consider the TCFD recommendations. In terms of climate reporting trends, we'll talk briefly on this slide around some of the drivers, the regulation and harmonization of efforts that are underway. And understandably, the acceleration in the voluntary support for the TCFD recommendations has been spurred by public pressure from stakeholders, but also policy progress by regulators and policy makers aimed at transitioning economies to low carbon economies. And so a number of regulators and governments around the world who themselves are under increasing pressure from stakeholders, have introduced mandatory requirements for the disclosure of climate-related financial risks and opportunities. And as more and more governments come on board, it's likely that we've seen the first of the mandatory TCFD reporting requirements coming into play. This is likely to increase in other countries and regions. For example, in September of last year in New Zealand, the New Zealand government announced proposed amendments to their Financial Markets Conduct Act, which, if approved by the New Zealand Parliament, will legislate the disclosure of TCFD-aligned reporting for around 200 large financial markets conduct reporting entities, and they would need to start reporting certain climate-related disclosures for their financial years commencing in 2022, with the first of these mandatory disclosures being publicly required in 2023. This will apply to listed companies, banks, insurers, and asset managers in New Zealand, and those active in New Zealand. In the United Kingdom, in November of last year, the UK became the first G20 country to announce their intention to make TCFD-aligned disclosures mandatory across their economy, and that would take place by 2025. But with a significant portion of mandatory requirements already taking place from 2023 onwards. And the expectation here is that all listed issuers, so listed companies, as well as large investors, such as retirement funds and fund managers, would need to start making mandatory TCFD-aligned disclosures as early as 2022. Earlier this year, in January, Switzerland, in the Swiss Federal Council, signed up to the recommendations of the TCFD, also proposing mandatory disclosure rules for Swiss companies. This will apply to Swiss-based banks and insurers who will be required to provide disclosures relating to their exposure to climate risk, as well as their processes for assessing and managing those risks. Lastly, in terms of the G7 and member countries to the G7, quite recently in June of this year, finance ministers and central bank governors from G7 countries agreed to mandate climate-related financial reporting, specifically aligned to the TCFD disclosures. And of course, in all these instances, it would be a work in progress to formalize that by these G7 member countries. And in all cases, implementation will likely be phased in over a period of time. Also important to highlight is the current harmonization efforts that are underway when it comes to sustainability reporting and sustainability standards globally. Last year in September, the 5 global sustainability, ESG, and integrated reporting framework and standard setting organizations, specifically the GRI, CDP, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, or CDSB, International Integrated Reporting Council, or IIRC, and the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB, set out their intent to work together to create an International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB, which is intended to become the global standard for reporting in a similar vein to the current global standard for accounting. So in conclusion, in terms of this slide, TCFD-aligned disclosures are certainly accelerating in multiple jurisdictions around the world. It's becoming clear that South African companies that have got domestic and international investors will also need to increasingly align to the TCFD framework in order to remain competitive for attracting international and domestic investments, as well as to satisfy international and emerging domestic climate disclosure requirements. If we move on to climate reporting trends and just looking at some of the domestic developments around carbon and climate. Climate change has been a long-standing policy issue in South Africa. Back in 2009, with the 15th Conference of the Parties, South Africa was one of the first countries to pledge their support towards fighting climate change. In 2012, we issued the National Climate Change Response Policy and the National Development Plan. And the National Development Plan included a chapter on the transition to a low carbon economy, chapter 5 in our NDP. In 2018, more recently, a climate change bill was introduced to Parliament in order to provide a solid basis for expanding South Africa's climate change adaptation and mitigation response. And the climate change bill provides the legislative framework to transition the current system of voluntary carbon budgets to a mandatory system and thereby establish sectoral emissions targets. In 2019, the South African government also introduced for the first time a carbon tax, which is intended to guide a low carbon economy transition. The first phase of the tax came into effect in June of 2019, and this tax, by pricing carbon, attempts to provide the appropriate price signal to move South Africa towards a more sustainable low carbon growth path. And lastly, in 2020, the South African government established the Presidential Climate Change Coordinating Committee. And the task of this committee is to advise South Africa's climate change response, affirming its commitment to a transition to a just, climate resilient and lower carbon economy, to both manage and mitigate the effects of anthropogenic interference with our climate system. And in the same year, South Africa also submitted its Low Emissions Development Strategy 2050 to the UNFCCC. I'm going to use this as an opportunity just to pause and to see if there are any questions that may have come up in the chat function. I realize there's quite a lot of theory that's being provided. So I see that there's a question from Non-Tutuzelo. Perhaps if we can unmute Non-Tutuzelo, please, and we can have your question.
Hi, Adrian. Thanks for the presentation. I'm just wondering if, like, is there a further level of accountability that will be built into this reporting? Because I'm like, sure, we're gonna get, so everyone's gonna report about it, but then what are the accountability measures provided beyond that in terms of action? I think I'm just sort of wary of like reputation management kind of approaches, because that doesn't really help in getting any action around the response to the effects of climate change done.
Thank you, Non-Tutuzelo. That's a great question, and I will attempt an answer, and then I'd invite others on the panel to also provide a view. So I think TCFD is very much underpinned with the intention that investors and stakeholders will hold organizations, companies accountable in terms of their climate risk disclosures, as they do in terms of other financial and ESG disclosures. I think regulators also around the world are also starting to clarify specific expectations, but I think we all understand that regulators have their own resourcing challenges, and so there is certainly an expectation that the market will, to a certain extent, self-regulate, and that would be through accountability and oversight by institutional investors, other stakeholders, civil society, government, etc. But I think certainly, the additional guidance and recommendations or requirements that are being provided by governments are taking it to a stronger position. But this is where I'd like to invite Brent or Seren if they'd like to contribute.
Hey, Adrian. Yeah, no, I think this is also, I mean, I'll have a quick go and then I'll pass on to Seren. And then I think, Adrian, it might also be a good chance for you to respond to Andrew Kilder's earlier question about the link between King 4 and TCFD.
Sure.
So I mean, I think you've summed it up quite well. I think the move to mandatory reporting is probably stronger than people realize. I think the reason for that is I think it's become quite clear that in the last couple of years, the discourse really has shifted from climate change being a kind of medium-term risk to being a kind of current reality. And I think the latest IPCC report, I think, has just again reiterated that the climate impacts are being felt today. So I mean, even before then, I think there's been a number of legal opinions, throughout the world, saying that climate change is a material risk, and therefore under fiduciary duty, it's a material risk that needs to be considered now already. I think with the latest IPCC report, where there's now significant proof that climate change is already having impacts, I think this is only going to become stronger. So I think that's going to have two implications. The first is it's going to drive mandatory reporting, because it's just like the systemic risk is coming to the fore. And secondly, I think it's also going to start driving climate litigation, which I think we've already seen overseas. So I think while the TCFD was conceptualized, using market pressure to a large extent, I think increasingly legal and regulatory pressure is going to start underpinning disclosure. But I'd love to hear Seren's response to this.
Yeah, I agree with that, Brent, and I think Adrian also, you set it up perfectly in terms of the investors and shareholders' responsibilities in digesting this information. And that's kind of where my view is in terms of investors digesting climate change information and that becoming part of the price of shares of companies and the cost of debt for companies. If your company is exhibiting higher transition risks or higher risk to climate change, then the price someone's willing to pay for your share is going to be lower than, theoretically speaking, identical company that's managing their climate risk better. So I think it becomes an investor and shareholder, a credit lender and an underwriter. It becomes their responsibility almost for the accountability, for keeping the companies accountable in terms of how they can access capital, how they can access finance, and as well as how they vote at AGMs, how they vote on resolutions. So the accountability might not be, a specific regulator coming into play. The regulators can encourage disclosure, but in terms of, I think, where the question was, how do we as a society almost keep these companies in check to make sure that they're delivering on their social promises? I think the investment community, the investors community, the financial sector has a big part to play in digesting all this information and rewarding those who are managing their risks well, and penalizing those who are managing their risk poorly. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much, Seren and Brent, for your respective comments there as well. Just to respond on Andrew's question around the relationship between King 4 and TCFD, there's no formal relationship between King 4 and TCFD, but obviously King 4 and the previous King codes introduced the concept of the triple bottom line and integrated thinking, integrated reporting, the responsibility for governing entities such as boards of directors to provide information to stakeholders and investors on materially relevant factors, whether they are financial or non-financial, but will have an impact on the financials of the company. Our next webinar in the series taking place on Monday is going to be looking in more detail at governance and management as it relates to the TCFD recommendations for governance and managing climate-related risks. What is hot off the press, though, and I believe the Institute of Directors Southern Africa is publishing it today, is a kind of a position paper or a primer on the role of directors, company directors, as it relates to climate risk. And I think they have, the IODSA and the King Committee have already contributed to some work that's been done by, I think, the Commonwealth International Law Center, which has published 2 papers on effectively fiduciary duty by directors as it relates to climate risk. And one of those papers has got a South Africa specific focus. So I think, you know, going forward, one will see, you know, increasing alignment in any revisions to the King Code and some of the kind of practice notes that the King Committee issues from time to time. And I think work is also underway by the Johannesburg Stock Exchange in terms of the listing requirements and, you know, perhaps elevating climate risk to a greater level, given the increasing shareholder and stakeholder interest in terms of how companies are both disclosing on climate-related risks, but also how they are constituting their boards of directors, and are there, you know, sufficiently skilled directors able to deal with some of the technical aspects around climate risk and disclosure. So I hope that's been helpful. Let me just see, are there any further questions that might have come up? And I've looked for, sorry, Andrew, last thing is I've looked for the paper, whether it's been published and it's online yet. I think it's still to be made available later today. So we will also share that via the project's resource site on the DNA website. So please do keep an eye out and follow there. Okay, I'm going to continue with the next slides, and we can always pick up any further questions that may arise during this second part of this presentation. So I've already mentioned the Low Emissions Development Strategy 2050, which really motivated from an SA Inc. perspective the importance of TCFD aligned reporting. Making sure that climate change related risks and opportunities are managed and understood, and that finance available can be deployed in a climate compatible way. Our National Treasury has also been very active in this area under their Sustainable Finance Initiative, and I'm sure we'll share a link to that website as well to assist you just to understand more about all that's happening under this sustainable finance workstream led by National Treasury. But the Sustainable Finance Initiative is hosted by the Banking Association of South Africa, or BASA, under the Climate Risk Steering Group, and is chaired by National Treasury. And using the input from this specific working group, National Treasury back in 2020 released a technical paper called Financing a Sustainable Economy, which was published for public comment. More recently, in June of this year, National Treasury released a draft version of a National Green Finance Taxonomy, which will act as an official classification or catalogue, which will determine the minimum criteria for any asset, project, or sector that's seeking to be eligible to be defined as green, both in line with international best practice and national South African priorities. Again, the Sustainable Finance Taxonomy seeks to address climate change and other environmental priorities, but also seeking to reduce social risks and enhance social impacts that sustainable finance offers. The taxonomy should help investors, issuers, and other financial sector stakeholders to both track, monitor, and demonstrate the credentials of their green activities in a more confident and efficient way. And the South African Green Finance Taxonomy strongly aligns to that of the taxonomy that the EU has also issued. In 2019, the Financial Sector Conduct Authority issued a guidance note specifically for South African retirement funds. And the guidance note is titled Sustainability of Investment Assets in the Context of a Retirement Fund's Investment Policy Statement. This guidance note is there to further endorse and support the requirements which were issued in 2012 with the revision of Regulation 28 of the Pension Funds Act, which requires trustees of pension funds to consider ESG issues in their investment decision making. And so the guidance note is additional guidance to trustees and funds on how to do that. And it needs to be closely linked to the investment policy statement for each retirement fund. And of course, it's the investment policy statement, which is really outlining their investment beliefs, their investment approach, and often it is included in the mandates which are given to service providers such as fund managers, etc. Also, what may be of interest is that the FSCA is currently revising or working on a new governance directive, which will replace the PF 130 note to trustees. And effectively what this does is it clarifies the FSCA's minimum governance expectations for retirement funds, and by extension, all of their service providers. So the FSCA is also very supportive of the increased disclosure on ESG and sustainability matters, including increasingly climate risk. The Prudential Authority, who, as you know, is responsible for regulating financial institutions and market infrastructure to promote and enhance South African financial market safety and soundness, and to specifically support financial stability in the country. The Prudential Authority is a member of the International Sustainable Insurance Forum and believes that climate risk reporting is indeed a crucial element in understanding both physical and transition risk, as they will both impact on the South African financial sector. And currently, the Prudential Authority is working towards developing a robust and consistent framework for assessing and reporting against climate risk. The Prudential Authority, which sits within the SARB, has included climate risk in its risk assessment matrix for 2020. And I know that a lot of work is being done behind the scenes, specifically around taxonomy work and climate scenarios. I've already spoken about Regulation 28, but perhaps just to mention that, as you may know, Regulation 28 is currently under review. The proposed changes to Regulation 28 are making an allowance for a higher allocation to infrastructure assets, across multiple asset classes. Infrastructure assets are long-term assets, also with potential, environmental and social impacts. And so again, we're likely to see increased guidance from the regulation around broader ESG and climate-related disclosures being made available, both to the regulator, but also to investors and other stakeholders. Moving on to private sector and civil society drivers of disclosure. I think from a lot of the research that's been done as part of this project, one sees that South African corporate organizations have been leading the way in terms of reporting against TCFD and climate, building on their CDP reports that have been around for close to a decade, if not longer. And so, commercial entities are generally, well advanced when it comes to reporting on climate, because this is not brand new. Where I think there is room for further improvement is that reporting by state-owned entities and other public interest entities. And I think there's work in progress there. And then also, one has seen a great uptick in the number of reports being made by banks as well as large insurers and asset managers around climate risk and their response to climate risk, and providing TCFD public reports. And as mentioned earlier on the previous slide, the JSE, as well as other industry associations such as the Banking Association of South Africa, are certainly working with National Treasury's Sustainable Finance Initiative to bring about better kind of guidance and requirements and resourcing for their members and other stakeholders. Briefly speaking to the research project that Six Capitals did on behalf of WWF South Africa, and which received funding from Sanlam. This was a project which involved extensive engagement with a number of organizations and individuals active in the broader reporting space in South Africa. So we interviewed 9 reporting organizations, many of whom were large emitters or large financiers to resource-intensive industries. We interviewed 13 investor organizations, and across the board, we were interviewing representatives from asset managers, asset consultants, industry bodies, regulatory bodies, retirement funds, activist groups, and listed companies. Broadly speaking, the research found that although that much progress has been made both by investors and reporting organizations in recent years, the view was that the companies or the issuers are leading the way, with a fair amount of work left to be done by investors. But that being said, this research was predominantly done in the last quarter of 2020. And you may well know that a lot of financial services firms have produced TCFD-aligned reports, many of which are standalone climate reports within the last 6 months. And so one is seeing advances and much progress over a very quick period of time, both by corporates that are increasing their level of disclosure, as well as the investor community as well. In terms of the support for TCFD reporting, part of this project we looked at, or DNA looked at, how many organizations are formally supporting TCFD, and then also which organizations are more informally supporting TCFD by producing TCFD-aligned reports. In terms of industry associations, regulators, and unlisted private entities, 9 organizations have formally signed up for TCFD endorsement. 6 JSE listed companies have formally registered their TCFD support, and 7 JSE listed companies with overseas primary listings have also formally registered their support for TCFD. On the informal support side, where listed companies are disclosing TCFD-aligned reports, providing climate information, 10 of those have done so on an informal basis by means of their reporting, and 13 JSE listed companies have disclosed that they intend to disclose TCFD-aligned climate information in their next reporting period. This is available in the DNA Economics led report, the State of Climate-Related Financial Disclosure in South Africa, which is also available via our project website. And so a lot of this progress is as a result of an increased understanding of climate risks by South African stakeholders across the spectrum. There's a lot more focus on what are the gaps when it comes to TCFD reporting. We are seeing increased fruitful engagements between investors, corporates, and other stakeholders. And for example, a number of shareholder resolutions that have been tabled at South African bank company AGMs around policies around funding carbon intensive assets, disclosing around climate risk and climate risk strategies, as well as identifying potential directors on some of these boards, non-executive directors, where it may be viewed that there are perceived conflicts of interest relative to some of their other non-executive board responsibilities. And so we're seeing increased internal stakeholder buy-in within companies, as well as with these improvements in terms of the number of TCFD aligned reports being made available in the public domain. It is also assisting with the comparability of data, but I think, as we'll all recognize, there's still a room for improvement in terms of standardized frameworks and metrics, and so there's still a lot of work to be done in that regard. So disclosure is certainly more widespread than I think many of us initially expected. In South Africa, this has been driven for the most part by our long-standing ESG disclosure guidance and requirements, such as through King 4, the JSE listing requirements, and the CRISA code for investors. And it's a work in progress, and hopefully through webinars and capacity building initiatives like today's session, we'll see further improvements. As we wrap up, and I see that there are one or two questions in the chat function, I think there are still a few barriers that need to be addressed, and we need to work together to address these barriers. And this project is intended to work towards addressing some of these barriers, and that is things that we're seeing in terms of limited training which is available for boards of directors to understand the significance of climate related risks, as well as opportunities. Hopefully this primer that the IOD South Africa is publishing today will assist in that regard, because climate risk is a mid to long term strategic risk, which will require resourcing, and it will require an appropriate strategy and framework as recommended by the TCFD. Again, we need to move towards standardized forms of reporting as more and more companies report aligned to the Tcfd framework. That should make life easier, and additional recommendations and guidance from industry bodies and industry sector organizations can also support that. I think there's growing understanding of the Tcfd recommendations, but there's still room for improvement there, and so that's why these types of capacity building, awareness raising workshops and webinars can assist in that regard. Some of our engagements from the reporting organizations as part of the WWF 6 Capitals report was that there was a fear that because your TCFD reporting progress is a journey, some reporting organizations felt that they would rather hold off on producing a TCFD report until they felt that they had sufficient substantive information to include in that report. And they were a little bit cautious around undue public scrutiny or reputational risk from putting out a report that might not be as quantitative as it was qualitative. And so I think we're starting to see that as there's more understanding about the TCFD framework, that it is a journey, that one doesn't have to have everything ready for your first report. Certainly there is the opportunity to start sooner rather than later, and to build expertise and capacity over a period, rather than waiting to have everything perfectly ready for public reporting. Again, a number of organizations cite lack of resources, not having the buy-in from executive management or senior levels within the organization. Again, underpinning and reinforcing the importance of awareness training, capacity building on the importance of climate risk as a strategic and material risk for South African entities. I think I'm going to stop there because I am mindful of time. So I'm going to quickly have a look at the chat and also just show my video again. If there are any questions, please do feel free to raise your hand. So thanks, Brent, for sharing the link to the Sustainable Finance Initiative. We're looking for any questions or comments that folk might want to make on this section of the presentation.
Adrian, I think while we're waiting for questions, I think one an interesting point that came up, as part of the research that that Adrian and his team and the WWF did on the fact sheets, was so they looked at 54 of the largest companies on the JSE, and because of the prevalence of CDP in South Africa, actually all but one of those companies disclosed some information against at least one of the TCFD pillars, and so that again this emphasizes the role that that CDP is playing in trying to get this information, this information out there. So even though TCFD is starting off slowly in South Africa, the more we're speaking to people, I think there is a general realization now that this does seem to have been settled into the kind of main climate risk reporting framework. My comment earlier, notwithstanding that its real role is to get people thinking about these risks rather than to report them, and also so even in terms of those those formal supporters, even though we're still at a small number, in the first quarter of this year, more people signed up to formally support the TCFD in South Africa than during any of the preceding years. So if that trend continues, the number of formal TCFD supporters in South Africa will double by the end of this year. So we're really seeing a bit of momentum, starting to create, to be created around TCFD, and we're hoping that this momentum will help to address, Adrian's point about, the kind of fear of public scrutiny. And in that, as more people start to, I suspect as some people move forward or some companies move forward in their reporting journey and put out qualitative early reporting, that will put more pressure on other companies to follow suit. And I think the option of waiting 2-3 years to put out a bells and whistles TCFD report, I think that's a risky approach. I think for most institutions, or at least I hope it turns out to be a risky proposition. Adrian, I see there's a comment about scenario exercises. As we mentioned earlier, there's going to be detailed training on scenario exercises, next month as part of this project. As I said, as part of this, we've already gone through the work of trying to understand what you can do in South Africa today already. So we wanted to be able to, to provide training that's useful, that people can start working on now already, and not just have to wait, don't have to spend too much time preparing. So yeah, if you keep an eye on the on the project website, you'll see the introduction to that training, and hopefully our colleagues at Vivid will be able to demystify scenario training. I see Melani's got her hand up. Melanie, great to have you back.
Hi, thanks. I've been having some choppy kind of connection, but I've been trying to follow the conversation. So just on the question here in the chat box regarding scenario analysis, I think in addition to the work that Vivid Economics will be doing, I think on theme 4 that WWF will be presenting, they'll also start going into kind of the concepts around scenario analysis. And Brent, I'm not sure if you agree with me. I agree with Kelly saying that it can be a complex exercise, but I do think what did one of our attendees in when was it, Monday's meeting or Tuesday's meeting, mention that it seems like some kind of voodoo magic that that people think scenario analysis is. But I think there's a lot of tools and exercises one can do to try and familiarize yourself with it and get more comfortable with it. So we'll start in theme 4 trying to unpack scenario analysis with WWF, and then there'll be additional training sessions that go into even more detail around that.
That's perfect, Melanie. No, thank you very much for highlighting that. Yeah, I missed a beat there. Yeah, no, I think, you know, having gone to theme 4 and then having the more advanced training after that, I think will really set people up nicely to start the scenario journey. And also, I mean, we've seen examples in South Africa. I mean, I'm speaking under correction now, but I think it was ShopRite in their latest sustainability report that, you know, had done a purely qualitative scenario exercise. So really, I mean, the purpose of scenarios is again to help you think through the different risk factors and the different ways you can be impacted. So it's very true. It's true that, you know, done fully, and you know, it can be a very complicated exercise, but it need not start there. You know, a lot of good insights can be gained from scenario analysis, even if it's just a qualitative, you know, kind of early stage analysis. Okay, Adrian, if there are no more questions, Adrian, there is a question I think you're probably well placed to deal with.
Thanks. Thanks, Brent, and thanks, Mel, for your comment. And yeah, James's question, does the TCFD target greenwashing? Sure, I think there's a lot of greenwashing in the market at the moment, especially with the focus on ESG issues and the massive inflows to ESG labeled funds brought on by the global pandemic. Again, I think, you know, organizations are always going to want to show themselves in the best possible light. So there is the temptation to, you know, produce unbalanced reporting, only reporting on the positive. And so I think the TCFD framework, in the way that it's been structured, is asking organizations to report in a balanced way. You're talking about, you know, disclosing how, you know, these issues are being considered at board and governance level. Again, you're required to identify the metrics and the targets that you're going to be reporting on. So I think it's intended to be more substantive in terms of your disclosure. That being said, I think there will still be a lot of marketing budget that gets pushed towards climate risk reporting going forward. And that, again, reinforces why it's so important that boards of directors hold management accountable around what is being published, and they need to sign off on what gets published, you know, on behalf of companies for investor information and stakeholders. Challenging company management around whether climate risk is being appropriately managed. Again, encouraging management to look at the opportunities that transitioning to a low carbon economy provides. And so I think, you know, greenwashing is very much prevalent at present, and it is a reputational risk to be caught out for greenwashing. And so that's why it is important to align to these best practice frameworks. Yeah, so I think now is an opportunity for, as we wrap up, Brent, I think just to go through the final few polling questions.
Yeah, no, indeed. So I think to focus, I think what we can do is we can run them at the same time. So as a focus, if you wouldn't mind, please also loading the post training survey for us in the chat. If you could please have a look at the chat, and then it would be great if you could please fill in that training to tell us how well we did and what we can do better. And then also the last couple of polling questions, we'll quickly run through those too, and then hopefully we'll have a couple of minutes to deal with any questions that that are still remaining. So yeah, and the last questions. So the next poll is, in your opinion, does the responsibility for disclosing climate-related information sit primarily with companies, investors, or both? It'll be really interesting to see your opinions on that. Okay, I'm seeing the emphasis definitely clearly seems to be on both, although there is a couple of people that feel that it should largely be companies. But yeah, I think that's probably right, and we would probably argue that it does sit with both, and probably with many other institutions. Okay, that's brilliant. I think we That's fine, Ms. Fokker. Now let's do the next one. Now, so one of the areas, having talked about ESG and this being in the context of ESG, is integration between the different legs of ESG, and particularly in terms of the climate discussion. Do you feel that gender and social inclusion concerns are being considered in the context of climate-related financial disclosures in South Africa? So the question there is, do you think these issues are being dealt with in an integrated ESG sense, or is there a risk of them ending up in silos, and being treated separately? So it'll be really interesting to see your responses to this question. Okay, so far I think we have an unanimous. Oh no, there is one person that believes that these are being considered currently. So that's really. That's very interesting, but I guess the vast majority of individuals are either not sure, or they feel that there's not enough, or well, that it isn't being addressed as one integrated fashion at the moment. Okay, so Fokker, could we have the final poll, or was that the final poll? Oh, no, there's the final poll. Now again, if we think that these issues aren't being integrated sufficiently currently, what do we think is missing? Or in your opinion, what priority gender equity and social inclusion issues and concerns would you like to see featured in an analysis and reporting toolkit? So which of these issues do you think should be considered and should be included? Okay, we seem to. Again, it seems to be we seem to get front runners relatively quickly in most of these sessions, or most of these polls. So yeah, no, that is okay. Now it seems to be equaling out a bit. So no, that's brilliant. So yeah, so if I can please ask you, we'll spend the last couple of minutes just seeing if there's any final questions. If I can please just implore you to please go and fill in our quick SurveyMonkey survey. It'll only take about 5 minutes about your views on this training, and then hopefully that will feed back into the following sessions that that we do, and we can make those sessions even better and even more engaging. Okay, on that note, I mean, before we I thank all our speakers, I just wanted to see if there are any final comments, any final questions. If there, if anyone would either pop your questions in the chat, or if you would like to raise your hand, we'd be very, very happy to kind of address those questions in these kind of final 5 minutes. Okay, currently we're only seeing positive messages, so thank you very much. We really appreciate that. Okay, so I will keep an eye on the questions, but I would just like to take the opportunity to thank all our speakers. I think this has really been a very nice introduction to this topic. I think it was all expertly handled. So Tapelu, Seren, Milani, Adrian, thank you very much for your inputs. We really enjoyed that, and I really look forward to seeing many of you participants and presenters at the following sessions. So yeah, I think unless there are any more questions, I think we'll call that a day. But please, if you have any comments, any questions, feel free to engage with us and let us know what you're thinking. And yeah, we hope to see you again at one of our events in the future. Thank you very much.